They would call it a paradox of war, that the Allies, who had measured every breath of Hitler's empire with precision and dread, chose not to strike the tyrant himself, but instead set their sights on a quieter, sharper mind, buried deep inside Germany's war machine. A man whose death would tilt the balance of the conflict more than any bomb dropped on Berlin. A man whose name, whispered in war rooms from London to Washington, carried more weight than the Führers in the cold arithmetic of strategy, Reinhard Heydrich. It began in the winter of 1941, when Europe felt like a continent locked inside its own grave. Snow coated the ruins of Warsaw like a shroud. The rail lines into the east ran day and night, never slowing, never starving for fuel. In those months, the war was not yet decided by tanks or divisions, but by decisions, dry, bureaucratic orders stamped in ink and carried out with mechanical cruelty. And the most terrifying architect of those decisions was not Hitler, who shouted his rage into marble halls, but Heydrich, who delivered death with silence and precision. The Allies understood this with a clarity they could neither publicly speak nor morally accept. But in private, behind sealed doors thick as vault walls, they admitted a truth they wished were not real. Hitler was chaotic, often irrational, capable of sabotaging his own empire. Heydrich was the opposite, ice-cold, methodical, and brilliant. A Nazi with an administrator's mind and a predator's instincts. The war planners knew that as long as Hitler ruled, Germany would make mistakes. But if Heydrich rose higher, if he gained full control of the Reich's intelligence, its occupied territories, and the machinery of extermination, the war would not drag on in the same stumbling pattern. It would sharpen. It would intensify. And the fragile window of opportunity the Allies still had might close forever. That realization settled over the British Special Operations executive like a weight placed on the chest, slow, suffocating, undeniable. And so they began to plan not for the most obvious target, but for the most dangerous one. The script of fate shifted toward Prague. In the cramped, dim-lit offices beneath Whitehall, the air smelled faintly of tobacco and damp stone. Maps lay unrolled across long oak tables, their edges curling upward like tired fingers. Names were scribbled in the margins with pencil strokes sharp enough to betray the tension behind them. The electric lights hummed overhead, flickering as if anxious of the decisions being made below. At the far end of the room sat a man who would later insist he had felt the course of the war pivot in that moment. Colonel Stuart Menzies, head of British intelligence, listened as a junior officer read aloud the latest intercepts. Heydrich had arrived in Prague a few months earlier as acting Reichsprotector of Bohemia and Moravia. In that short time, he had transformed the region from a resistant, simmering territory into one of the most brutally efficient engines of the Nazi war economy. Factories that had once whispered with sabotage now pounded day and night with obedient production. Resistance networks collapsed like brittle branches snapped under a boot. The Czechs, who had fought occupation with quiet defiance, now lived under the shadow of a man who believed mercy was weakness and hesitation a sin. Heydrich drove through Prague in an open-top Mercedes, confident that fear itself was armor enough. That arrogance, rare among high-ranking Nazis in hostile territory, planted the first seed. But it was another piece of intelligence, one delivered on a cold morning in December, that turned a seed into a mission. Churchill had been briefed on Heydrich's rising influence within the SS, his strategic insight on the Eastern Front, and rumors, difficult to verify but impossible to ignore, that if Hitler fell to illness or assassination, Heydrich was among the few considered capable of assuming power. For the Allies, that was the darkest possible scenario. Stopping Hitler meant ending a nightmare. Stopping Heydrich meant preventing one from becoming permanent. And so the question no one dared speak aloud took shape in every mind around the table. Why strike at the loudest monster when the quiet one posed the sharper threat? The decision, when it was finally made, felt less like a choice than a recognition of inevitability. A plan was drafted, one that would require precision bordering on the impossible, one that would depend on two young men far from their homes, men who had never imagined that history would hinge on their courage. Józef Gabčík and Jan Kubiš. Their names would one day be etched into stone, but in those early days they were simply soldiers chosen from the Czechoslovak forces in exile. Their faces still carried the strain of displacement, the loss of their homeland, the weight of watching their country carved apart and swallowed by the Reich. But beneath that grief lay a steel the SOE recognized immediately. In a safe house outside London, the training began. Cold mornings filled with the sharp reports of pistol fire. Nights spent memorizing street maps of Prague until the lines and alleyways blurred behind their eyelids. They learned how to disappear in plain sight, how to lie without hesitation, how to wait for hours without moving, how to kill with one motion and no doubt. But what defined them most was not their skill. It was something raw, an understanding that they were not simply fighting a war of nations, but a war against a man whose existence poisoned everything around him. In quiet moments, when the instructor stepped out and the wind pressed against the windows like a restless spirit, Gabčík would whisper that if they failed, they would not just die, they would condemn millions to the consequences of Heydrich's survival. Kubiš never answered. He simply checked the mechanism of his weapon again and again, as if hoping perfection could outweigh fate.
Their mission was given a name whispered with a mixture of hope and dread: Operation Anthropoid.
The night before their deployment, a storm settled over the British countryside. The wind rattled the loose panes of the safe house, and rain lashed against the ground like handfuls of gravel. Inside, the atmosphere felt strangely calm, as if the world outside absorbed all the turbulence so the two men could find a moment of stillness. Gabčík wrote a short letter to his mother, though he knew she might never read it. Kubiš folded his uniform with soldierly precision, even though he would not wear it again until he was dead or victorious. Their instructors shook their hands, not as officers, but as men recognizing the bravery standing before them. And then, in the early hours of a frozen December morning, a black Halifax bomber lifted off from a silent runway. Inside its dark fuselage, lit only by a trembling red lamp, the two operatives sat strapped beside the open bay door. The cold bit through their jumpsuits like knives. Below them, England dissolved into shadows. Ahead of them, a continent in chains waited for a spark. When the plane crossed over occupied Europe, the clouds parted long enough for the moon to cast a pale corridor across the sky. Below, the forests and frozen fields of Bohemia stretched out like a vast, sleeping kingdom. The pilot signaled. Gabčík and Kubiš rose, hooked their lines, and stepped into the void. Their parachutes opened with the soft, haunting bloom of fabric, a sound swallowed instantly by the night. They landed miles off target, battered and half-frozen, but they survived, and once their boots touched Czech soil, the mission became real. Over the next months, they moved like shadows through Prague and the surrounding countryside, meeting with members of the resistance who risked their lives to help them. Every safe house was a sanctuary carved from terror. Every whisper carried the weight of death. Heydrich's name was spoken quietly, as if the walls themselves listened. Through it all, the two operatives rehearsed the ambush again and again. The timing, the distance, the angle of approach. They knew Heydrich's route, his car, his habits. They knew his arrogance. They knew he believed himself untouchable. And they knew that history often waits for arrogance to make its fatal mistake. In those final days before the attack, Prague seemed to hold its breath. Winter broke into a hesitant spring. The river carried fragments of ice downstream like fading memories. The people moved through the streets with the weary caution of a city that no longer believed in miracles. But somewhere, beneath the surface of ordinary life, two men prepared to strike the most dangerous Nazi in Europe. Not Hitler. Not the man who shouted, but the man who calculated. The man whose death could tilt the war. The man who had taught the world a savage truth, that evil does not always announce itself with fury. Sometimes it moves with quiet, deliberate purpose, and sometimes that is the most terrifying form of all. The morning of the ambush was approaching. The war was about to change. The sun rose over Prague on the morning of the ambush, with a pale, reluctant glow, as if the sky itself sensed the gravity of what the day would demand. Its light slid across rooftops and chimneys, catching the faint steam curling from bakeries beginning their work, glinting off cathedral spires that had witnessed centuries of triumph and ruin. But beneath the quiet facade, beneath the streetcars rattling into service and the distant clatter of shopkeepers unlocking their doors, there was a tension threaded through the city's heartbeat, a kind of held breath, suspended between dread and possibility. For months, Gabčík and Kubiš had rehearsed a single moment. A moment so brief that an untrained eye might miss it entirely, yet capable of reshaping the direction of the war. They had studied the route Heydrich traveled each morning from his home in Panenské Břežany to Prague Castle, a route he refused to alter because his pride insisted danger was for other men. He traveled in an open-top Mercedes, no escort, no armored protection, just the confidence of a man who believed terror was enough to shield him. The operatives had settled on a hairpin curve in the suburb of Liban, where the road narrowed and forced cars to slow. A perfect place for violence to erupt, sudden and decisive. There, beneath a canopy of leafy branches, stood a neglected tram stop, a small fenced garden, and a stone wall mottled by years of weather. It was an unremarkable corner of the city, made remarkable only by the destiny about to unfold. Gabčík arrived first. He wore a dark suit and hat, the picture of an ordinary worker on his way to nowhere in particular. Beneath his coat, wrapped tightly in cloth, rested his Sten submachine gun, light, compact, and temperamental, the kind of weapon that could spit death effortlessly when it worked, and betray its handler when it didn't. He checked it once more, fingers moving with the calm of a man who had repeated the gesture thousands of times. His breath clouded in the morning air as he adjusted his position near a lamppost, eyes scanning the curve of the road. Across from him, Kubiš approached with a satchel resting casually at his side. Inside was the device that would determine their fate, a modified anti-tank grenade, reworked into a weapon deadly enough to shatter an unarmored car. He took his place beside the garden fence, where the shadow still clung to the earth. His heart beat steadily, not from calm, but from the clarity of purpose that comes when all choices have narrowed to one. The city around them moved without suspicion. A woman walked her dog along the opposite pavement, its paws tapping lightly like the ticking of a metronome. A tram rumbled in the distance, humming with the tired energy of a city under occupation. Everything appeared ordinary, almost peaceful. But inside each man, the hours of training, the long nights of doubt and resolve, the memories of friends executed or exiled, all coiled into an unbreakable focus. Then came the distant growl of an engine. It was subtle at first, blending with the murmur of urban morning, but Gabčík recognized it instantly, the deep, confident purr of the Mercedes-Benz 320 Cabriolet B. He inhaled slowly, pressing his back to the post. His hand slipped inside his coat, fingers closing around the cool metal of the Sten. Kubiš shifted his weight, easing the satchel's strap off his shoulder. The car appeared at the top of the street, gleaming black even in the dim morning light. Heydrich sat in the passenger seat, his SS uniform immaculate, one gloved hand resting on the door. His posture radiated authority, an invisible aura of command that seemed to warp the air around him. The Czech driver, Klein, handled the wheel with military precision. As the car descended toward the curve, it slowed, predictably, inevitably. Gabčík stepped forward, pulling the Sten into view. Time constricted, every second thickening into something tangible. The city noise faded, replaced by the pounding of blood in his ears. He raised the weapon and aimed directly at the man who had orchestrated terror across half of Europe. He squeezed the trigger. A dull, choking clatter answered him, but no bullets. The Sten jammed. For a moment, the world seemed to collapse inward, a vortex of disbelief and horror. Gabčík stared at the useless weapon, his mission hanging on the edge of failure, the war itself teetering with it. Heydrich's eyes widened, but not with fear, with fury. He shouted for the driver to stop. Klein slammed the brakes. The Mercedes screeched to a halt barely 10 yards from the frozen operative. Heydrich rose from his seat, pulling his pistol, prepared to kill the man who had dared stand before him. But Kubish had already moved. With a swift, desperate motion, he pulled the grenade from his satchel, tore off the specialized cloth cover, and hurled it toward the front wheel of the Mercedes. The device sailed through the air, a single trembling arc of defiance. It struck the edge of the car's frame and detonated with a violent blast. The explosion tore through metal and flesh alike, sending shrapnel ripping into Heydrich's side. The windshield shattered. The car's body buckled as smoke billowed outward, carrying the acrid stench of burning rubber and ruptured steel. The bomb's concussion wave slapped against the nearby walls, sending echoes rolling across the square. Heydrich collapsed back into the seat, clutching his abdomen, his face twisted in shock, then pain, then rage so fierce it seemed inhuman. Kubish staggered from the blast, temporarily blinded by debris. Blood trickled from his forehead as he stumbled toward an escape route, pulling his pistol free but firing wildly to keep the driver at bay. Gabčík, stunned for a heartbeat, regained his senses. He dropped the Sten, pulled his sidearm and sprinted through the smoke. Klein was firing now, bullets cracking off stone and pavement. Civilians screamed and dove for cover. Heydrich, wounded but still consumed by a monstrous pride, attempted to rise. He managed 3 steps before his legs failed. He crumpled onto the cobblestones, gasping, one hand soaked in his own blood. The operatives fled through the twisting streets of Lieben, pursued by shouts, boots, and gunfire. They darted through courtyards, vaulted fences, slipped into alleys so narrow the walls brushed their shoulders. The city became a labyrinth of desperation, every turn a gamble. At one point, Gabčík ducked behind a delivery cart, breath heaving. Children stared at him with wide, frightened eyes. He nodded once, a silent apology, and moved on. Kubish ran toward a bicycle he had hidden earlier. He mounted it, pedaling furiously, his vision blurred, his muscles trembling. But he forced himself forward with the knowledge that every second they survived was a second Heydrich's empire trembled. Behind them, the wounded Reichsprotector was carried into a nearby building and soon into a hospital. His suit was shredded, his pale skin marked with deep lacerations and darkening bruises. The doctors would fight to save him, not because they loved him, but because to fail meant their own deaths. Surgery, transfusions, desperate interventions. The struggle to keep him alive became a grotesque theater of loyalty and fear. But the Allies' gamble had landed its blow. The man they deemed more dangerous than Hitler had been struck down, and the city knew it. By nightfall, Prague was a furnace of tension. Checkpoints appeared as if conjured from the air. Patrols swept through districts with ruthless efficiency. German officers shouted orders that cracked like whips against the quiet streets. But in the shadows, in whispers passed from home to home, the news spread. Someone had dared to strike Heydrich. Someone had shown that terror could bleed. And though the fear that followed would drown the city, for that single night, Prague felt the faint spark of a hope long buried. In the crypt of the Church of St. Cyril and Methodius, where Gabčík and Kubish would soon take refuge, the silence felt heavier than stone. The cost of their act was coming, inevitable and monstrous. But so too was the legacy they had etched into the war. For the first time, the Nazi regime had been pierced in its heart, not by armies, but by 2 men who had refused to let evil continue unchecked. The storm of retribution was gathering, and the final chapter of their stand was approaching.